Hi, this is Dan Korver, pastor here at Dalton Hill Baptist Church. We're a small Baptist church located in Owasso, Oklahoma. We're small enough to know you, but we're big enough to serve you and for you to serve as well. Our vision is to rescue, restore, and return to service. Rescue a non-believer or a believer who has been hurt or is lost, restoring them to Christ in fellowship with other believers with the desire that they in turn will help others along their way.
We've been going through the series on Moses, and it's just interesting how things work out. Today we're dealing with Passover, and we're also dealing with the Lord's Supper today. Just happened to be that way, right? You stop and think through it. We've gone through this will be the 9th study that we've had so far on dealing with Moses, and learn a great deal about him, obviously, and we know a lot of things. But I want us to, when you look at it today, I want you to stop and pretend like you don't know anything about it. Because I think when you read the story, we already know the outcome, we know what's going to take place, and so often what happens is we don't look at it as if we were in the scene. You really recognize it. So if you remember, we've looked at part of it, some of the studies in the past on Moses. The historical past affects the present circumstances. We've looked at that. We also saw that God's will, my way, doesn't work. Any of you ever tried it? Trying to do God's will and trying to do it on your own. We also saw that God's ways are not man's ways. In fact, if you remember, Isaiah 55 says what? My ways are not your ways, my thoughts are not your thoughts. Heaven is above, so are my thoughts from your thoughts. That's quite a bit of difference. And so I think it's important, because I think a lot of times sometimes in the end we recognize it, but so often in the middle we don't recognize it. Today you'll see some of that as well. What do you do when His directions don't make sense? What do we do? What about you get some others, what do you do when you don't understand His ways? Those are some questions we'll try to answer today. And you think about it, you'll find it in Exodus 11 and 12. But first of all, what do you do when we don't understand His ways or make sense? We've looked at it before, but in Proverbs chapter 3, what does it tell us in verse 5 and 6?
Trust in the Lord with all your heart.
And trust in the Lord with what?
All.
How many of you find it, or you trust Him part of it when it makes sense? Trust the Lord with all your heart, first requirement. Second one, don't what? Lean unto your own
Understanding.
And most of us are going to use our circumstances and all our senses, our sight, hearing, whatever it might be. Acknowledge Him in all our ways. How many of us acknowledge Him in all our ways, and how many of us acknowledge Him in only certain things? I've had people tell me, well, church is one thing, but business is business during the week. Acknowledge Him in everything. I'll give you an example of that. In the results, remember, it says He will make your way straight, smooth, or will show you the way. How many of you ever heard of the B-24 Liberator called Lady Be Good? Very, very famous plane. Only had one mission. Flying over Africa, didn't realize, first time we didn't really realize tailwinds. So they way overshot their target because of the tailwinds. Navigator error, they also, as at night, they looked out and they see the sand, and they think the sand is the Mediterranean Sea. So they keep going until they run out of fuel. They all parachute out. All of them but one made it. They then rendezvous and they start walking. And they walk the opposite direction of where they should have been walking because of what? They didn't land where they thought they were. So they used their senses, what they could see, navigator error, not realizing the tailwinds. And even only with one canteen, they lived for 8 days trying to go through that. All of them ended up obviously dying, and later found the plane in 58. A movie was made about it. But you stop and think about it. They relied on their senses. But how many of us have relied on our senses? And it didn't work too well. So when you're walking with the Lord, we have to He does give us a mind, does give us different things to use, but there comes times when some of the things He asks us to do don't make sense. And so I think it's important, when directions are given, what do? We follow them, and so on. So let's look at it. Look at the instructions that they're giving here in Exodus chapter 11. And you remember they've had 9 plagues, and the different plagues, you remember the first ones affected everybody, the Egyptians and the Hebrews. The last ones just affected, for the most part, just the Egyptians. God was making a distinction. But when you think about it, what do you do when His directions don't make sense? And look at some of these. Remember, you've never heard this before. Read it for the first time. Notice what He says to Moses. Now Moses said to Moses, "One more plague I'll bring on Pharaoh and on Egypt, and after that He'll let you go from here. In fact, He will go out and He will surely drive you out from here." What's happened on the first 9? He'd say you can go only until the plague stopped. No, you can't go. Now how are you going to believe it? 9 times we've done plagues and nothing's happened, and you're telling me you're going to do one more and He's going to actually encourage us to leave. Now, how many of you are going to believe that? Notice the next thing I think He said. Notice what He tells the people. This is to the Jews, to the Hebrews. "Speak now to the hearing of the people, that each one asks from his neighbor, each woman from her neighbor, for articles of silver and articles of gold. So you have been slaves for 430 years. Your dad was a slave, grandfather was a slave, great-grandfather was a slave. And now you're going to all walk up to your neighbors as slaves and say, what?
Some jewelry.
Give me all your gold and silver. How well is that going to work if I go to work tomorrow and I go ask my boss and say, I want a raise. I want twice as much as I'm making right now. What do you think they're going to do? Now, how of this would be, God said me to go ask for gold and silver. Now, obviously, later it's going to tell you they were given it because of payment for the 430 years. But we know that part of the story. But how of us would have been obedient to say, okay, God, I've seen these plagues. This is real. All right. I work for this mean guy. He wouldn't give you a drink of water hardly. And now I'm going to ask for his gold and his silver. Notice the key in all of this is what? Obedience. See what happens. That's the directions. But again, I'll think about it. If God's in control of the circumstances, does He know what's going on? But how of us think He often doesn't. Would I ask for the gold? How of us wouldn't have asked for anything? Let's look at the distinctions. Notice in verse 3. The Lord gave the people favor in sight of the Egyptians. Furthermore, the man Moses himself was greatly esteemed in the land of Egypt, both in sight of Pharaoh's servants and in sight of the people. God gave them, and you think about part of that, when you look at it, Moses is through God's bringing these plagues, and they're magicians and everybody else could only duplicate the first 2. They couldn't duplicate the rest, and they said, this is the finger of God. He's got something really going on. And the last one's, hey, we got punished over here with all these plagues, and over here in Goshen with the Hebrews, they didn't get anything. There's something going on. So notice you have this distinction, but notice the destiny, then notice in verse 4. Now remember, you've never heard this before. And this is what God's telling you. Moses said, now again, how would you like to be Moses in saying these things? Moses says, thus saith the Lord, about midnight I'm going to go out in the midst of Egypt, and all the firstborn of the land of Egypt shall die, from the firstborn of the Pharaoh sits on his throne, even to the firstborn of the slave girl who is beside the millstone, all the firstborn of cattle as well. At midnight tonight, every firstborn, think about it, that could be firstborn, that could be 1 year of age, they could be 70 years of age. Going out, every animal, firstborn. That firstborn may have others of their own. You think about it. I'm going to kill there's going to be a death of everyone, where it says there'll be a cry that's never been like that in Egypt then or ever since that time. Now again, you stop and think about it. But notice what he also says, that it's not one thing. Notice in verse 7, but against any of the sons of Israel, a dog does not even bark, whether man or beast, that you may understand how God makes distinction between Egypt and Israel. All right, going to go out. All these are going to lose the firstborn. And this line's right here. And nobody over here is going to. If there's any disturbance in a neighborhood, does a dog start barking? No disturbance whatsoever over here. Now you think about it, how would you like to be Moses making this delivery? How many of us are going to believe the delivery when it's given to us? Does it make sense? You go on a little bit further, it's interesting what happens in verse 8. They've already seen the 9 plagues. And all these your servants will come down and bow themselves before me, saying, go out of you and all the people who follow you. And after that he went out. This is what he's saying to Pharaoh. Can you imagine? You're going to the Pharaoh would be obviously the king. Abimelech in Genesis is another term for king, depending on what nation you're at, or it could be king, or in our country, president. And Moses and Aaron went and did all that God said to do. And Pharaoh obviously says no. So notice then what's going to happen then in chapter 12. He says what's going to happen. So then notice in chapter 12, again, verse 1 and 2, they now have a new calendar. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, this month shall be the beginning of months for you. It will be the first month of the year for you. Changing the calendar. They're still on that calendar today. And it would be, notice it would be on the first month, which would be March, April, basically, Nisan or Abib, depending on which language you're speaking in. And that's where their calendar. That's the reason why, if you think about it, Passover every year falls very similar in time frame to our Easter. And that's not quite the same because they're on a lunar calendar and we're on a solar calendar. But notice what he tells them to do. Now again, this is your Israel. You're hearing this for the very first time. Your slaves. This is going to happen. Notice what he tells them to do. You're going to get a lamb on the 10th day, and on the 14th day it tells you what to do. Notice in verse 4, if your household is too small for a lamb, then he and his neighbor, they can go together. And the lamb, notice in verse 5, in verse 4 you divide it. The lamb shall be unblemished, male, year-old. You shall take it from the sheep or from the goats. You shall keep it till the 14th day of the same month, and the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel is to kill it at twilight. So at twilight, you remember when is the death angel supposed to come? At twilight, you're supposed to do it. Remember, you've never done this before. And notice what's supposed to happen. You're supposed to take the blood, if you look later in the chapter, with you use a hyssop branch, and you're going to go on the doorpost, and you're going to put some on the left, some on the top, and some on the right. And you and I are thinking, what good is that going to do? You remember what did God tell you to do? Without the shedding of blood, there's no forgiveness of sins. We know where it's going. But remember, you're the Israelites. This is the first time you've been told to do this. Go on. Notice also some other strange things it tells you to do. Verse 8, you shall eat the flesh that same night, roasted with fire. They shall eat it with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. Don't eat any of it raw, or boil any of it with water, but rather roast it with fire, both its head, its legs, and all its entrails. Is that the normal way you'd cook something with all its intestines and everything else inside of it? No. That's what God told you to do. Does it make sense? No? Notice something else it tells you to do. So here you think about it. God's telling you that you're going to put this on, and when God sees it, He's going to what? He's going to pass over it. Do I believe that shedding of that blood is going to spare my family? Do I believe the shedding of Jesus Christ is going to spare my family? Or not my family, but me. A personal deal. That's why we have the Lord's Supper. It's where it's started way that. But again, we look at it how many years later, and it makes sense to us. But remember, this is the first time you're experiencing this. Are you going to do it? That makes no sense. A blood of a lamb is going to spare my family and all my firstborn. of everything? You think there might have been someone that didn't do it? Notice what he also tells you to do. Can you imagine doing this? It's, again, not what they normally would do. Notice in 11. You shall eat it, its manner, with your loins girded, your sandals on your feet, your staff in your hand. You shall eat it in haste, is the Lord's Supper. What do they normally do with their sandals? You leave them outside. You go to that part of the world, they still do. Alright, you're going to eat it. You're going to eat it, you're going to get, and you're going to be ready. Because when the death angel, remember he said that they are going to come and they're going to drive you out. They don't want you there. How many of us are going to say, yeah, at 2 in the morning somebody's going to come knock on my door and tell me to get out? If you look a little later on, you're going to tell you there's over 6,000 or 600,000 males. Now you got men, that doesn't count their families and their children. That's 2 million people. You take 2 million people and you leave, where do you go? How are you going to feed them? When you're a slave, at least if you're working, you're getting food. You think about the obedience it takes for them to do this. Tremendous obedience. When we look in 2 weeks, we're going to see the one where he intentionally puts them in a cul-de-sac where they have nowhere to go. How do you like to be following God and he takes you into a cul-de-sac, a dead end, and you have nowhere to go? And God intentionally took them. You notice they have this, and then he tells them then why he's doing this, verse 12, for I will go throughout the land of Egypt, and that night will strike down the firstborn of the land, both man and beast, against all the gods of Egypt. I will execute judgment. I am the Lord. And the blood shall be assigned to you on the houses where you live. I see the blood, I'll pass over it, and no plague will befall you, destroy, when I strike the land of Egypt. On this day it will be a memorial to you, and you'll keep it from generation to generation, a permanent thing. So you think about it, this is what they're told to do, right? Told when to do it. They're told what to do with the lamb. They're told to be dressed and ready to go. And then jump down to, you think about a little bit further, if you jump down to 23, we'll see what actually happened. The Lord will pass through and smite the Egyptians, when he sees the blood on the lintel on the 2 doorposts. The Lord will pass over it, will not allow it. You shall observe this event and your children forever, and it'll come about when you enter the land the Lord will give you, as he promised. You observe this rite, and it'll come about when your children will say to you, what does this rite mean to you? You shall ask. It's the Lord's Supper, or excuse me, it's the Passover sacrifice to the Lord, who passed over the houses of the sons of Israel in Egypt when he smote the Egyptians that spared our homes. And the Lord and the people bowed down and they worshipped. The sons of Israel went out and did exactly what the Lord through Moses had commanded them to do. How obedient will we be? Has God given us any commands to do? Think about it. That's pretty amazing when you think about what they were being asked to do. They went and asked their neighbors for the gold and the silver. They did all this. They were dressed, ready to go, because they believed what? God was going to do exactly what he said. Let's see what happens then in the deliverance. If you go down to 29, it came about at midnight, the Lord struck all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, and the firstborn of Pharaoh, who sat on his throne, to the firstborn of the captive who was in the dungeon, all the firstborn of cattle. Pharaoh rose in the night, he and all his servants, and all the Egyptians. There was a great cry in Egypt, from there was no home, where not someone was dead. Then he called for Moses and Aaron at night, and said, rise, get out from here among my people, both you and the sons of Israel, and go worship the Lord as you have said. Take both your flocks, your herds, and all of as you said, go. Notice it's interesting, and bless me also. Before, remember, Pharaoh was believed to be the incarnate of God of Re. He's now asking you, ask a greater to bless you, not to lessen. And notice the Egyptians, notice in 33, urged the people to send them out from the land in haste. They said, we shall all die. And notice then they give them in 35. They requested the articles of silver, gold, and clothing, and the Egyptians gave them. We just lost firstborn, I don't care, take whatever. Exactly what, but the Egyptians didn't do what God should have told them to do. Pharaoh wouldn't let them go until God forced him to. But God's in control. But it's interesting. I want you to look at one other because we have the Lord's Supper to do. But jump over to verse 40 and 41. I want you to look at this. Now the time that the sons of Israel lived in Egypt was 430 years. And it came by the end of the 430 years. What does it say?
To the very day.
To the very day. Does God have everything in control? He said it. If you go all the way back to Genesis, way back, you'll find it. He said they were going to be in captivity in Egypt. He said it from the beginning. Before they ever went down there, He said they would be there. And it's to the very day. If you read the book of Daniel, you'll likewise find when Jesus was on the cross, it was to the very day. You look in the book of Romans, when He comes back, it's to the very day. We don't know the day, but He does. So let's think about it when we look at it. We look at these different things. Talking about the Passover, which then later led to what we have as the Lord's Supper today, what we celebrate. But look at it, I think it's interesting. What direction are you going? What means? Who gives you instructions? Most of us rely on what? Ourselves, our senses, what other people say. And it's worked out for the most part. But you may be on that D24 and not realize that you're going the wrong way. We can't rely on our own senses if they're what they need. You look at it again, do I believe God's Word? Every religion in the world, they're religious, but they believe it's works, works, works. Everything's on works. You have the fivefold path if you're in Islam. You have the eightfold way if you're in Buddhism. You have all of them. They believe you have good and bad, and you put it in the scale and it weighs. You include your thoughts. Anybody going to make it?
No.
If you do any driving in Tulsa, you're not going to make it. Seriously, there's no way you're going to. That's why, in fact, in Romans 4 and verse 4, it says, we owe God good works. In Ephesians 2, 8, 9, for by grace are you saved through faith. Not of yourselves is the gift of God, but not of works, lest any man should boast. Verse 10 tells you need to go to works, which we do as a thankfulness for God, but it won't get me to heaven. And so you notice again, I think what we can learn, obedience. Obedience is what led them to do what they should have done and led to their deliverance. Obedience is what gets us there too.
We'd love for you to come and visit with us and fellowship with us. We're located at 8263 North Owasso Expressway, which is on the east side of Highway 169 North, between 76th and 86th Street North. We have coffee and fellowship from 8:30 to 9 Sundays, followed by Sunday school for all ages from 9 to 9:45, and our Sunday morning worship service is from 10 to 11. We likewise have a Wednesday night service for all ages from 7 to 8. Now may the Lord of peace Himself give you peace at all times, and in every way the Lord be with you all the time.